And one of my favorite hobbies, as some of you know, is fishing. And this past year, I got to do something new, which was to rent a small boat by myself and go out onto the lake to fish. And and what was fascinating is when you look at a lake, it's so huge, you really don't know where the fishes are. But then when you do find them in one spot, you drop your anchor and you stay there to fish around that spot. And those who enjoy that sport, you understand how wonderful it can be. That's kind of an analogy I was thinking of what we are doing with this series of Walk Through the Bible. The Bible is huge and 66 books. There are so many things and themes and topics. But what we are doing here is, as we are surveying through all these different books, we are dropping our anchor on specific texts and we are trying to draw from around it all the rich things that we can know and learn about God and apply it in our lives. And we are right now in the book of Exodus, and we spoke about Moses and his burning bush experience last week. And this week, we are going to talk about one of the most pivotal passages in all of Scripture. And I have titled this sermon today as From Bondage to Freedom, the Grace, Power, and the Glory of Redemption. Imagine being imprisoned for several decades for a crime you didn't commit. This is the story of Andy Dufresne in this fictionalized work called The Shawshank Redemption. Some of you, they made a movie of it. Some of you may have seen it. And it's become a cultic movie. And people watch that several times. And every time you watch, you get drawn into the character. And you see how Andy, who is wrongfully imprisoned and is enduring suffering and injustice and the weight of hopelessness, but patiently, and he devises a plan, and he has an unshakable belief that he will be free, and he escapes through a tunnel. He spent years digging and emerges from the prison's sewage system. He had to wade through 300, 400 yards of that, and finally stands in the rain, and when he's washed, he has this feeling of real freedom. It's so exhilarating to watch that. That's a fictionalized story, but in 1981, there was a man named Jerry McCauley who passed away, but he left behind a tremendous legacy of transformation. He was once a very hardened criminal and an alcoholic, and he was imprisoned multiple times for wrongful things he actually did. But in his darkest moment, while he was still in the prison, he encountered the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is something that tremendously changed his life, and he became a gospel preacher, and he started helping others experience that same redemption that he had experienced. His story is a testimony that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. And what we are reading in this book of Exodus today is the story of Israelites who were experiencing slavery for not 1 year or 2 years, but for 430 years. And Exodus is a book that's not merely talking about the exodus of people. The book of Exodus is actually a commentary of God's attributes, where God is doing a self-revelation of himself to individuals, to the nation of Israel, to the nation of Egypt, and actually to the whole world. And you have to have this dual lens view of the book to understand the trajectory of God's work in the life of Israel. And in this passage that we read today, we can see how the grace of God and the power of God work together to redeem the nation of Israel for the glory of God. How he is helping them to experience freedom from 430 years of slavery. And I want to start by looking at the grace of God. At first glance, it doesn't look like there is anything evident in this story about the grace of God, especially when we read the Old Testament. We tend to think we don't see much about God's grace. But every act that we read here demonstrates to us how God's grace is preeminently displayed in his works. So, how would you suggest that someone who has been enslaved for 430 years free themselves from slavery? Historically, if you looked at human slavery that has existed and perhaps even now exists in some parts of the world, there is either usually a revolt or a war or a protest or a political action. Even the abolition of slavery in the modern times was done by William Wilberforce and others through an act of parliament and law. Now here, after 430 years of slavery, God is now not asking the Israelites to prepare weapons, to get ready for war, or to develop a strategy to break themselves free. What he is starting in this chapter to read, he's telling the Israelites is, I am going to do everything for you to help you experience freedom from slavery. And what are the things that God does without the Israelites having to do nothing, not even to move their little finger? First of all, it starts in verse 12. It says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt. First of all, God gives them two leaders, Moses and Aaron. Moses is a prophetic voice hearing from God and declaring to them. And Aaron is a priest who is trying to be a priest bridging them and God. So God says, I have decided to redeem you, my people, and I'm going to start that by giving you two people whom I'm going to use. Second, he says, he's going to give them a new beginning, literally, by saying, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. He's saying, I'm going to give you also a new calendar to help you remember what is going to happen. What's the big deal with having a new calendar about when the first month starts? This was calendar that was in contrast to the Egyptian calendar and other calendars in those times, which revolved around agricultural seasons. Typically, the end of the year was fall when harvest was complete, and they had a harvest festival, and that symbolized the end of life for their crops, and the new year began in fall. But God is telling them, your new year is going to begin literally from tonight, and which is spring, because you're going to experience a new beginning. I'm going to literally do everything new for you. You're going to have a total makeover. You're going to have a new life, a new beginning, a new start. And I want to commemorate that by asking you to have a new calendar. And thirdly, he says he's going to strike down everyone in Egypt, that he is going to fight the battle for them, and they just have to watch. And that's how they have to redeem. And what is the response God expects from the people of Israel? It's very simple. He expects three responses from his children. The same response that he expects from you and me even till today. And the response was simply to believe, to hope, and to let go. Three very simple things that God is expecting and providing for you and me for us to understand and experience his grace. He wants us to believe in a substitutionary death. And we'll talk about that first. And he does that by asking them to sacrifice a lamb. Now, why would he want them to sacrifice a lamb? Why couldn't he just strike down the Egyptians and their armies and just take them off. Why is this whole sacrificing a lamb thing even necessary? Is a question that will come before us. Israelites had lived for 430 years under the oppression. When you live that long in a country or a culture that is very different from yours, you slowly start to absorbing the things of that culture around you, isn't it? They say if you live for more than 7 years away from your country where you were born and raised, in another country, you actually change. You begin to assimilate or integrate or absorb things that even when you get back to your home country, you're no longer the same person. So it happened, if it's just 7 years, imagine what 430 years would have done to the nation of Israel. They are far removed from God's acts in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Centuries have passed, and they are living in a very dominant, powerful cultural regime, which is so different than what was their own. And so, slowly, the things of Egypt probably had crept into their own lives. God wanted to redeem them from the enemy outside of them, but he also wanted to redeem them from the things that were inside of them that enslaved them. A question that might be asked is, why did the Israelites live for 430 years in Egypt? Always they had known what God's desire was. The reason God told Abraham to go was for him to give the land of Canaan. And when there was a famine and when they moved to Egypt, they didn't have to stay for 430 years, but you see, life became very comfortable in Egypt, isn't it? They got the Egyptian dream. They started living the Egyptian dream, and it was great. A beautiful house, 2 chariots, and a couple of dogs. Fantastic. Why should we move? It's amazing. Let's just live on and on and on. All until a king changed. And he changes all the rules. That can happen all the time. I don't know how it would have played out. Perhaps he said, well, your visas are expiring. Go back. Or he creates an inside sphere. Oh, these guys are taking our jobs. And turns the whole nation of Egypt against the Israelites. Until then, they were happy, and now there is a wake-up call. They really called to God only when life got hard for them. But God was gracious, and he was going to redeem them from both of them. The reason why they stayed back was because they thought their self and their needs were more important than God's plans and purposes. And God wanted to redeem them from the self-centeredness that they had gotten so comfortable and settled in as well. And this self-centeredness is one of the ways in which the Bible calls and describes it in a simple word as sin. And sin always demands a sacrifice. The Bible says the wages of sin is death. And without death, there can be no forgiveness. And God says, well, I'm not going to kill you because you're my people, but I want you to know what my plan is. I want you to find a lamb that is going to be killed, and its blood is going to be shed. He's graciously providing an alternative to them, that they find a substitutionary lamb or a baby goat which is just a year old. Again, this is not something tremendous. They have to work. They already have this. He tells them to find a lamb or a goat, not a lion or a tiger, an exotic animal. Usually the Bible throughout uses the imagery of calling us as sheep, for 2 reasons. One is sheep are dumb. They don't know what to do. They just go around, they keep getting astray. But in this case, he talks of having a lamb, which was a very docile animal, and a lamb or a baby goat, which is 1 year old, they really don't know what to do. They can't even do anything dumb. They are even too incapable of that. That's the closest to it being kind of pure, if you may call. So he's giving them an idea that this sacrifice that I'm trying to substitute needs to have some elements. One is it has to be a pure thing. It can't have spots. It's not that if it is blemished or it doesn't have a feet or a leg, its meat was going to taste any different when they have to eat it. But he was trying to embed some essential aspects in it before that. And that too, he says, just one for a house. And if you don't even have that, share it with a neighbor. And there are 6 characteristics of this lamb. It says it has to be without blemish, it has to be male, it has to be 1 year old. And everyone has to eat this together. There has to be a community aspect to it. And its blood needs to be applied on the doorpost. And those homes in which they did this, it was an act of faith. A faith that God was not going to destroy them. God didn't need to know who is where purely by coming into every house and watching the sign. He already knows who they are. So this painting, this blood on the doorpost was more an act of faith for the Israelites than it was something that God needed. And that's the first thing he expected them to do. I don't want you, Israelites, to fight your own battles. I'm going to fight the battle for you. All I want you to do is believe, trust, and come to me in faith. Do what I ask you. I've given you a substitute, and as if you are humble to embrace that, you're going to be saved. It's the same principle till today. And secondly, he wants them to have hope in redemption by telling them how they need to eat this food. He says, first of all, this food is something they have to eat after it goes through fire quickly, and they have to eat this with their belt fastened and sandals on their feet and their staff in hand, believing that redemption is just around the corner. Literally in a few hours, they're going to have to leave. So God, even the way he puts this whole requirement for them is to be in a manner that they don't need utensils to cook. They don't need elaborate food to make. Thank God it was not an Indian meal that God asked them to make. They would have not made it out of Egypt. Biryani is awesome, but it can kill you, is what would have been the tagline for them at that time. They had to make it fast, so just roast it in there, pick some bitter herbs, and eat it, and have your dress on, your belt on, and just you're ready to flee. And the symbolic act of doing that was for them to demonstrate hope that God is actually going to do this. They still did not know how God was going to do it. They had seen all the 9 plagues that had happened before, but he wants them to now believe in hope one more time that this is the moment. And believe and have hope. And finally, redemption cannot happen unless we let go. Imagine God asking them to leave a house where they had lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. That was perhaps the house they lived, their father lived, their grandfather lived, their great-grandfather lived. That place has been so familiar to them. Most of us who have moved from another country to here, or even when you move from one house to another, you know how painful that can be, isn't it? Before we moved into this house that we are living in right now, which we bought around 12, 13 years ago when I was still working, Prior to that, we just counted the first day we moved into our house, how many times we had moved. And we had moved 16 times in 10 years across 3 continents. And I was so tired. I'm like, God, please do not make us move again. Moving is so hard, isn't it? Because moving involves also letting go of your friends, letting go of your family, letting go of things that are so familiar, so accustomed to us. By now, they're living in a very comfortable Egyptian dream home. And God says you have to leave. You're not going to have that comfortable home anymore. You're not going to be able to make and eat your comfortable food. You're not going to get that favorite drink of yours every day. I want you to let go and go. But our response usually, and all the time, and often, when we go through any sort of challenges, is to fight. We think we can fix this thing. Whatever is the challenge that is thrown at us, our default response is, let me use my strength and fix it. Whether it is sickness or suffering, or let's call this doctor or that doctor, or if it is a loss of job, and okay, let me update my resume, let me do all of those are wonderful things. But if they are the only things, then you're still fighting. You're not ready to let go, because God is not just primarily interested in helping you fight the enemy outside. He wants to do something deep in your heart to fight the enemy within, this invisible enemy within us that makes us do this all the time. Do you think God's plan really was to help the people of Israel to be freed from Egypt and go to Canaan and live a life happily ever after? Is that it? Do you think God really desired for them to have great health, wealth, and prosperity? And that's all his desire was? Is that it? No. God graciously gives that to everybody, isn't it? Living in Silicon Valley, look around. People who believe in God, people who do not believe in God, they have all these blessings. But God's real desire was for them to be his people. His real desire was their heart. And for that, they need to let go. Whether they were trying to fight the enemy outside with their own strength, or even spiritually inside, trying to become a better person by your own abilities, God was trying to tell them, stop, let go. You cannot. Because that goes contrary to what grace is. There is this beautiful quote by Dallas Willard. He says, grace is not opposed to effort, it is opposed to earning. Grace is not opposed to effort, it is opposed to earning. So when God allows us to go through painful times, the question to ask is really, do I trust and believe in God's plan for my life, and am I willing to let go and let God, as cliche as that sounds? Embracing the grace of God is the first step in experiencing true freedom. Secondly, we'll move on to the power of God in redemption from verse 12 and 13. And this is one of the most pivotal texts in the book of Exodus, where God reveals to, first of all, Moses, and then to his nation, and eventually the whole world is going to know what he is going to accomplish. He says, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The key phrase to lock in here is God is giving one of the reasons he is going to demonstrate his power is because he is going to show his power over all the gods of Egypt. What are all the gods of Egypt? I think understanding a little bit of Egyptian religion, the religion of the Egyptians, would perhaps help us to appreciate what's going on here. The Egyptians were polytheistic. They believed that anything and everything can be a god. They idolized forces of nature and nature itself as God. And that's one of the very specific reasons God sent 9 different plagues to counter and demonstrate to them how he is really the one who has power over all the gods. Now, first of all, God is not acknowledging that there are these real gods. What made these gods gods were not that they were gods who existed, but these were gods that had become idolized and was a figment of the imagination of the people of Egypt. They had created all these different idols towards which their hearts gravitated to. And then when they made them as the idol, they believed that that idol has the power to give them what they want. So God sends these 9 plagues to demonstrate he has power over all the earth. First of all, that he sent, the first plague was to demonstrate he has power over water. And then the plagues he sent, several of them were to demonstrate he has power over the animals, frogs, lice, flies, livestock, locusts. Then he demonstrates, unleashes some plagues to show he has power over nature. He sends hail and darkness to demonstrate he has power even above the earth, as they were sometimes worshiping celestial bodies. And then even power over the human body, for which he sends boils. But each of these plagues was targeted to one specific idol in the minds of the Egyptians, and they had a name for these gods. When God sent the first plague to turn water to blood, it was to demonstrate his power over the Nile god, Hapi, I don't know how to say it exactly. Because Nile was the biggest river, it's the source of livelihood. And they thought, if we make this thing that's giving us our livelihood and agriculture and farming, if we make that a god and we give our lives and we start worshiping it, our lives will be happy. And perhaps in English, if it's synonymous to happy, that could be a reason why they named it happy or happy. And the frogs, the plague of the frogs was over a god named Heket, which is the frog-headed goddess. The plague over lives was a power over Geb, who is the god of the earth for the Egyptians. And the plague of flies was to demonstrate his power over Capri, the insect god that the Egyptians worshipped. And the livestock disease that he sends to all the livestock was to demonstrate his power over Apis, which is the bull god that they worshipped. And the plague of boils that he sent was to demonstrate his power over Imhotep, which was the god of medicine. And the power over Nut, which is the sky goddess, was what he wanted to counter by sending the plague of hail. And he sent the plague of locusts to demonstrate his power over Seth, who was the god of storms that they worshipped. And darkness was a plague he sent to demonstrate his power over Ra, the sun god of Egypt, who's very famous. And finally, now he's going to send the last plague, the death of the firstborn, to demonstrate his power over Pharaoh himself, who called himself as God. And every time God sends a plague, we see that the Pharaoh temporarily obeys and then goes back. Because the pull of the idols and this desire of self was far greater than surrendering to God. Sometimes we tend to be like that too, isn't it? We probably do not have the idols that the Egyptians had. We have created different idols from our own thoughts and our life in this world. We call ourselves Christians, but when we live in a very secularized world around us, we easily tend to idolize things that people around us have idolized. So it is maybe a very unique idol that we all have and different idols that we struggle with. And we need to identify what are those idols for us. In Silicon Valley, perhaps, among suburban families, There are a few idols that are always lurking around and sometimes find their way into our own lives as Christians. One of the biggest idols in this place is the idol of success or winning. Winning and success is a big God, whether it's in your school or work or even sports, isn't it? Or perhaps it's the idol of appearance or being or fitting in or wanting everyone to love me and keep coming to me and affirming me all the time. Otherwise, you feel insecure. Another idol among suburban families, especially living in a very competitive environment like Silicon Valley, can be children, and especially as immigrants. Because the desire is where we move to a new country to give a better life for our children and then make children the God of our lives. Another predominant idol in this place is money or the stock market. And there are many more that can be idols for us, starting with our health or fitness or career, or even a life partner that we think when we find this ideal person, only perfect person, then my life will be perfect. Or our self-image of how we look. Or it can be the person we work for in our places of work or the organization that we are willing to sacrifice anything, including God and maybe even church. When work comes up on Sunday, no problem. I don't need to go to church. I can work because I'm really afraid if I don't, I lose my job, but I know God's not going to kill me, isn't it? And when you live in a culture that actually embraces and worships these things, if we are unguarded, we tend to let that creep into our own lives. And it's only when we have a crisis then that we cry out to God, and God graciously intervenes and redeems us. And then once we are temporarily relieved from this consequence or this pain, we tend to again go back like the Pharaoh did to our own comfortable lives, doing what we have done. But even in wielding his power, God is gracious by giving them several chances, one after the other, because he wants them to let go of their idols. So, my dear friends, I do not know what kind of plague you are experiencing in your life. If you're experiencing plague after plague after plague in your life, maybe God is trying to tell you the fight is not with the enemy outside, the fight is with the enemy inside in your own heart. As I said earlier, God is not primarily interested in freeing Israel to give them a good life. He wanted to give them a good new heart. And he has given us something way better than that through his own son, Jesus Christ, so we can experience freedom from all our idolatry, including ourselves. You know, there is this wonderful quote by Warren Wiersbe, especially for someone who feels that, why am I still experiencing this pain or trial and again? Why is God delaying this freedom? And the Israelites were right to have asked that in their own lives. For 430 years of suffering, Warren Wiersbe says, God's delays are not God's denials. God's delays are not God's denials. Because God is actively at work. And what would God do is he would pass over them when he destroys the others who would not listen to him after giving them grace upon grace upon grace. And since this is such a very iconic demonstration of God's power, he tells them in the verses that follow that of how they need to carve out, after they go into the promised land, carve out an entire week to remember this by celebrating this as the feast of Passover or unleavened bread. Because that was a problem that happened. They forgot who their God was. They forgot what he had done in the lives of their forefathers. He doesn't want them to repeat it again. And so he says, I want you to set up 1 week in the first month of every year. From this day, beginning the first day, for 7 days, you will not eat any bread that is leavened. And you will do the Passover on the final day, so that you will remember what I did for you today in Egypt. And he gives that as a task for every household. And again, a small excursus here. And this is where, my dear friends, I'm specifically talking to all the men, that you are the spiritual leader of your home. You have a part to play in repeating and remembering to your children who our God is and what he has done by leading them spiritually in your homes. You know, when Moses is writing this letter, the people who are reading this, the generation who is reading this is already a second generation. Sadly, just like the Egyptians, despite God continuing to show his grace through his power for 40 years, all but only 2 of their fathers were saved. God was patient with the Pharaoh over 9 plagues, but God was patient over one entire generation for 40 years, and still they were unwilling to believe, and they hardened their hearts, and they could not enter their promised land. Other than Joshua and Caleb, because the rest of them held on to their idols and feared their idols more than the big God. But Joshua and Caleb were not afraid of the idols or the enemies, because they knew they have a God who is bigger than all of them. And that is our very first sacrament in the Bible, a symbolic of the Last Supper, or the communion that we celebrate, that Jesus participates in several hundred years later. That is a demonstration of God's power. And lastly, we want to focus on the glory of God in redemption. You know, verse 29 to 32, we read, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. God destroys all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. At first glance, when we read this, it looks like, is this a bloodthirsty God? How can God be so evil in killing all the firstborn children and even animals? This doesn't sound like a good God. You know, but there is a reason God does that. If you read earlier in the book of Exodus, the first couple of chapters, before Moses was born, if you refresh your memories, what happened in the land of Egypt? The Pharaoh had commanded that every firstborn child in all the Israelite homes ought to be killed. And Moses was preserved by God's sovereign providential intervention. That was almost a genocide attempt that the Pharaohs cold-heartedly did, and the Israelites did not, or perhaps could not, respond and retaliate to redeem justice by killing the Egyptians. But God is a perfectly just God, and he acts. He may not act immediately, but he acts in his time to demonstrate his justice. You know, the word glory, as I've shared earlier, in the Hebrew is the word kavod, which means weightiness. What makes God's attributes so heavy and stand out from others? And the glory of God is beautifully reflected when all his attributes work together for his purpose. And we see that happening right here. His power is so vividly demonstrated, not just through all the 9 plagues, but in this 10th plague in very spectacular fashion. His grace is demonstrated by how through that he is preserving and saving his people through all this. His provision is beautifully demonstrated by him giving a lamb to be sacrificed and providing for them for 40 years from the people who plundered them. And his justice is being demonstrated by how he takes out the vengeance of the people who killed the firstborn of his people, to demonstrate his justice. And that's how God's glory comes in, how all of his attributes, his power, his grace, his provision, and his justice all work together to create redemption. And this was just the beginning. This was just a glimpse. This was just a foreshadow of something more spectacular that was going to come. How all of these were going to be combined and eventually expressed in his son, Jesus Christ. You know, Jesus Christ demonstrated the power of God through all the miracles he did, much more bigger than the miracles God did through Moses towards the Egyptians. God demonstrated his provision for us through Jesus Christ, who is the perfect lamb. He was the Lamb of God that was slain. We read even before the foundation of the world. God, even before creating you and me, provided this sacrificial lamb. We don't have to go and fetch a lamb or a goat. God himself provided his own son even before he created us. And in Revelations, we read that he was the lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world. And God's justice was satisfied on the cross. Our God is a just God. He cannot let our sin or trespass go. So he unleashed his unbridled wrath on Jesus on the cross. It was my idolatry and my sinfulness and your idolatry and your sinfulness for which Jesus died, experiencing God's wrath on the cross. God didn't kill any firstborn. He killed his own firstborn son, Jesus Christ. And now this God's grace is now for all who believe in this Jesus. And by his blood, we are redeemed. He washes us, as we sang, and makes us as white, as our sins disappear as white as snow. And that's why in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, Paul talks about this. He says, in their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. As we close, my dear friends, let me remind you to embrace God's grace in your life. Pray for God's grace in your life in an area you want to experience freedom. Whether you're fighting an enemy without or you're fighting an enemy within your own selves, if you are your own enemy, ask God to give you grace. He's our ultimate healer, not just of our bodies, but of our souls as well. Secondly, surrender to God's power and do not resist. The same cliche phrase, let go and let God, is a reminder we need always. Let go of your idols. If you're still experiencing plague after plague after plague in your life, maybe really God is trying to get into your heart. He really wants to give you a new heart. And he wants us to desire that more than others. And not to fight and let go. And finally, when we come to the cross and if you have embraced God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ, let's try to live our lives to reflect that glory in all areas of our lives.